Welcome back, SAVMA Symposium attendees. This is session 3 of 3 in Climbing Mount Debt, Navigating Your Student Loans. I'm Dr. Tony Bartels. We're going to kind of come into the home stretch here. We're going to talk more about repayment and how you can prepare for repayment as a student before you graduate, and hopefully tie all the concepts that we've been talking about together in terms of developing a student loan repayment strategy for your situation. Just a quick recap on where we've been and where we're headed here. So in the first session, we talked about your student loans and doing that history, physical exam, diagnostics. That's where we went and obtained our student aid data file from studentaid.gov. We uploaded it to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. We did an estimation of our debt at graduation with the in-school loan estimator. We haven't really talked in detail about the repayment options. We're going to do that in this session. We've shown some finances and what that might look like based on the data we have from the 2020 graduating class. We did talk about minimizing your in-school borrowing in session 2, the previous session. And this is going to be the session that brings up more of the side effects and how you can think about your student loans in terms of the various ways that you can pay them back, and then match a strategy that fits with your finances, your anticipated finances after graduation. And as we kind of close it out, we're going to talk about things to think about beyond student debt that will help you with your financial wellness. All right, so I'm going to jump ahead here to our Repay Wiser section. All right, a little bit too far there. So this is about, and it's probably the most common question that I get is, what's the best, quote, best way to pay back your student loans? And that's a complicated answer. The best is not always the fastest, and the fastest is not always the cheapest. And this is a phenomenon that's pretty unique to federal student loans, and it's because we have the ability to make payments based on our income. But that also comes with a whole host of side effects and things that are a little bit counterintuitive sometimes and confusing, to say the least. But when I define the quote best strategy, it's the repayment strategy that allows me to reduce my risk to myself and my family overall. I do get a lot of questions from those folks who are married or who get married and then start to have kids, or they already have kids, about the impact of their student loans on their family. Federal student loans are your responsibility only, right? There's no scenario where your federal student loans falls to your family to be responsible for them. It's one of the really beneficial pieces of your federal student loans. Federal student loans also allow me, through the income-driven repayment plans, to maximize my monthly cash flow. I find that probably one of the most confusing parts of student loan repayment for new grads is knowing how much they should pay towards their student loans. And the great thing about income-driven repayment is it takes that decision out of the equation, right? My income decides how much I should pay, right? And I know it'll never be more than, say, 10% of my discretionary income, which means I have the other 90% to do what I see fit with, to work towards all of my other financial goals. Ideally, we'll also pick the plan that's going to be the least costly, but all of those things may not always line up. But these first two are more important, in my opinion, than just shooting for this one. But oftentimes, and particularly when we have that debt to income ratio greater than 2, we get all 3 of these to align, right? And that's what we're going to spend some time working through in this final session. When you graduate, you're going to have 2 primary ways that you can pay your student loans, presuming you have federal student loans. So you can take a time-driven or more traditional approach, or there's these income-driven repayment options that we've alluded to throughout the previous 2 sessions. Time-driven, again, is the traditional way we think about paying back any kind of loan. And so that applies to any kind of private loan that you have, as well as federal student loans. You can choose a time-driven repayment strategy for your federal student loans as well. This is a standard 10-year, like the default repayment plan, right? So if you do nothing with your federal student loans after you graduate, they put you in that 10-year plan, which takes your principal, the interest, and calculates a payment to pay the balance in full in 10 years. Or you can extend it out to 15, 20, 25, even 30 years, depending on the loan type that you have. But the income-driven plans are available only for the federal student loans, right? There are no private income-driven repayment plans that I'm aware of. Um, Only the federal student loans have this ability to pay them back as a function of your income. And that also opens up a bunch of different questions in terms of, well, should I worry about paying based on my income, or should I just refinance my loans with a private lender and that and make the payments known every month, and if I can get a lower interest rate, maybe I'll pay less towards my loans. But not all of that is always true, and we'll look at that in just a little bit in terms of analyzing what a traditional repayment plan requires you to pay. A time-driven repayment plan requires you to pay, and that oftentimes lowering the interest rate doesn't necessarily lower your payment nor your total repayment costs. So let's just do a quick overview of time-driven repayment, right? So this is an example of various amounts that you might borrow. An average interest rate of 5%. If you wanted to pay it back over 10 years, shouldn't be surprising that the more that you borrow, the higher the monthly payment, right? So this will give you an idea of how much it costs to pay back student loans under a time-driven repayment strategy over 10 years. If I extend it out to 15 years, I can see that the monthly payment goes down, right? But the amount that I pay in interest goes up, right? If I extend it out to 20 years, right? Same thing, monthly payment comes down, but the amount that I pay in interest goes up, right? So that's the trade-off with time-driven repayment. The longer you're in repayment, the more you're going to pay in interest, right? But this also assures that if you make this minimum monthly payment for 20 years, that your loan balance will be zero, right? So that's kind of how the mechanics of how time-driven repayment works. Where we run into trouble, particularly with new veterinary graduates, is that let's say that even if you've got $100,000 income after taxes in a state like Kansas for a single person, that means you're going to have about $6,000 per month to work with, right? So if you've got $200,000 of student loans, I mean, that's a third of your take-home pay, right? That's a lot, right? If you have a $300,000 balance, like in our example that we've been using in the first two sessions, it's actually a little higher than that. This is more than half of your take-home pay, right? That's probably not going to work. I mean, you might be able to will it to work, but you're making some serious sacrifices, and you're also then sacrificing things that you probably shouldn't be sacrificing, right? So like emergency funds, or you might end up putting things on credit cards, or you're not saving for retirement, or you're not buying a home or starting a family, buying a practice, because too much of your income is going towards your monthly student loan payment, right? So this is where we're going to start to test whether or not these time-driven repayment options actually serve us well with the types of balances that we see for new graduate veterinarians. So let's even, if we come over here, and just to illustrate this, I'm going to bring up one of my favorite online calculators, right? So you can look at this online pretty much anywhere you want. Bankrate, this is one of the earlier sites that I remember using for financial information and assistance. They have a whole bunch of tools, and one of them is this calculator, but these calculators live all over the internet. And what I commonly see from new grads is that they think that they're, going to pay off their loans as fast as possible. And usually if I ask them what that means, they say maybe it's about 12 or 13 years, right? And they think that they can get a interest rate much lower than what they have in their federal student loans. And maybe it is a low interest rate environment, but chances are you're probably not going to get a super low interest rate on unsecured debt like your student loans right out of school, right? You just don't have the credit history to justify that, which means a lot of these private lenders are going to entice you to bring a cosigner to the table, which means you're putting them at risk too. But let's say that you could get a 3% interest rate on that $200,000 of student loans, right? You're still paying $1,600 per month, right? On a 12-year repayment plan. Let's say you wanted to be really aggressive. I want to be done with my student loans in 5 years at a 3% interest rate, right? That's a $3,600 a month payment, right? And I just showed you with $100,000 for a single person in Kansas, you're taking home, just shy of $6,000 per month, right? That is really hard to maintain, even for 5 years, right? So this is probably not a viable financial path forward, right? But it does seem to be the path that many veterinary students want to take immediately after graduation. So let's measure that up against what your income actually requires you to pay. And this is where the differences become pretty apparent pretty quickly. So the way that income-driven repayment works is they have you pay a percent of your discretionary income. And discretionary income is your taxable income minus 150% of the federal poverty guidelines. And you can look these up. They get changed every year based roughly on inflation. But the plan that you choose will determine the percentage of the discretionary income, right? So the newer versions, Pay, Repay, the new version of IBR, has you paying 10% of your discretionary income. So what does that look like, right? So if we've got a $100,000 income, right, we subtract off our federal poverty guidelines, 150% of that. So 12,880 is the federal poverty threshold for a family size of 1 in the lower 48 states. Right? So you just look that up. And our discretionary income in this example is about $81,000. So if I take 10% of that and then divide it into monthly payments, so I'm dividing it by 12, I get a minimum monthly payment of $672 per month. Right? So now think back to our loan calculator where we were comparing various monthly payment amounts and how much more all of them were, right? And this is much less than any of those time-driven repayment approaches, right? Which means it frees up cash flow that you can use to do other things like save for retirement, build an emergency fund, buy a home, buy a practice, all those things that are going to require cash flow and some time for you to build up those savings, right? And this is one of the ways that you can do that. So what I do ask people to do is is a two-step approach. What does your income require you to pay, right? And to know that, kind of back to our debt to income ratio equation, right? We've been talking a lot about the D side, but now we have to talk about the I side, the income side, right? What do you think your income's going to be when you graduate, right? And then once you know what that number is, or it starts to become more clear, then you can plug it into this formula and see what your income requires you to pay towards your student loans. And then compare that against, well, what were you planning to pay, right? So when you say, I want to pay my loans back as fast as possible, I'm going to challenge you to define that, right? What does as fast as possible mean for you? Is that 5 years, 7 years, 20 years, right? I mean, you have to really define the amount of time that you think it's going to take you to pay back your student loans, and then figure out what the monthly payment needs to be in order to achieve that goal. You compare that monthly payment to what your income requires you to pay, and if there's a significant difference there, then choose the income-driven repayment plan, right? Because you'll have more money in your budget to do other things than just paying back your student loans. All of the income-driven repayment plans are a little bit different, right? So I don't expect you to memorize this. You guys will all have access to this to this presentation. So when you get closer to picking an income-driven plan, this information will become more important to you. All of this information is also baked into the VIN Foundation Loan Repayment Simulator, right? So when you run a simulation and you're comparing something like pay as you earn to the new version of IVR or revised pay as you earn, all of these things will be accounted for in there, right? So you don't have to sweat this too much, but when you do get to the point of choosing one, if you're stuck between a couple, you might want to look at this chart, see what the differences are between those plans that you're focusing on, and start asking questions or figuring out what those plan differences might be. it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about income-driven repayment if we didn't also talk about forgiveness, right? Because federal student loans have forgiveness provisions, and there's two different ways that forgiveness can happen. There's a taxable version, which I've talked about previously. If you make minimum monthly payments and you have a balance remaining at the end, it can get forgiven, but you also may have to pay tax on that. There's a non-taxable version as well. That's called public service loan forgiveness. Now, you still have to have the right loan types and use the right repayment plans, but if you satisfy all of the public service loan forgiveness requirements, you don't have to pay tax when you reach the forgiveness period. So let's talk about the difference here. So public service loan forgiveness is the holy grail, if you will, of student loan repayment, right? So this is, if you make payments on the right loans using the right repayment plans while working in the right jobs, you can apply to have the remaining balance of your loans forgiven tax-free. Direct loans, only direct loans are eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So while it may matter to you little to none to know what types of student loans that you have, if you want to pursue public service loan forgiveness, you're going to need to know which types of loans you have, right? Because only direct loans qualify for public service loan forgiveness. You also have to know how income-driven repayment plans work, because in order to be making an eligible public service loan forgiveness payment, you have to be using an income-driven repayment plan, right? So income-driven repayment on your direct loans while working as an employee of a state, federal, local, tribal, or other 501c3 organization are the three check boxes that you have to meet in order to be making a qualifying payment under public service loan forgiveness. This is not the same as the taxable version of forgiveness, right? There's some overlap here because you do have to use an income-driven repayment plan in order to make a qualifying payment, right? But it's not the same as income-driven. Income-driven repayment is just a component of public service loan forgiveness, right? There are other components of public service loan forgiveness. It's also not the same as the veterinary medical loan repayment program. I get that question a lot, right? So I for whatever reason, the veterinary medical loan repayment program gets advertised well to veterinary students, and they all seem to be very aware of it, and some of them have some great plans to take advantage of it. But this is completely different from income-driven repayment and completely different from public service loan forgiveness, right? It doesn't make it good, bad, or otherwise. There are some interactions and some relations between the two, but they are not related at all, right? So they're completely different loan repayment programs that you can use all of these simultaneously. If you could somehow figure out a way to find a nonprofit who allows you to make the public service loan forgiveness qualifying payments while also meeting the veterinary medical loan repayment program payments, you could get both of them conceivably. But it also wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So a veterinary medical loan repayment program makes bulk payments towards your loans for a period of qualifying service. The public service loan forgiveness program, the goal there is to pay as little as possible towards your student loans, right? So you have the maximum amount forgiven and you don't have to pay the tax. So the incentives are not necessarily aligned with all of these different repayment programs. So just know that there are differences and that they do overlap, right? And they can be used simultaneously, but sometimes the incentives are not aligned. If you're curious about how public service loan forgiveness works a little more, there's an employment certification form. There's a lot of good details in there, and you're going to want to use that and get familiar with it if you think you're going to be working for a qualifying employer after graduation. Okay, so the taxable version of forgiveness. If you make payments under an income-driven repayment plan and you reach the maximum repayment period and there's a balance remaining, that balance will be forgiven, canceled, right? You'll get a 1099-C in the mail that year that says X amount of dollars has been canceled on your behalf. You have to report that on your taxes when you file your taxes that year. That will include any remaining principal or unpaid interest. You don't have to apply for this, right? It is strictly triggered on the number of payments that have been made, right? So revised pay as you earn. I gave you the example in the first session, and my wife and I are using that. We're working towards forgiveness. We've got 16 years before we hit it. right? So Repay has a maximum repayment period of 25 years, right? So we've completed 9 years of that, right? And we have 16 years to go, but we're more than halfway to our target that we think we'll need to cover the tax. Pay as you earn has a 20-year maximum repayment period, right? So you're in repayment for a shorter period of time. And if there's a balance remaining, your loans will be forgiven after that 20-year maximum repayment period, right? So knowing the maximum repayment period is really important when it comes to income-driven repayment, and then using a tool like the loan repayment simulator that we'll get to in just a few here to help you project what that tax might be if you anticipate having a balance remaining. You may not, right? Just because you use an income-driven repayment plan does not automatically mean that you're going to hit forgiveness and have to pay a tax. There's still a chance that you'll pay your balance to zero based on your income, right? As your income goes up, your payments go up. If you make sufficient payments enough while you're using income-driven repayment, you can still pay your balance to zero before you reach forgiveness, right? So it really just depends on what your balance is, your student loan balance, and what your income does during repayment. And that's where we're going to turn to the loan repayment simulator. So let's come back to the, let me find the, here we go. That's the one I'm looking for. So this was our in-school loan estimation that we worked up for our Kansas State student who's going to graduate in 2024, right? So this was after our borrow better, we're going to reduce a few $1,000s per year in living expenses. And we ran our best guess of interest rates and borrowed amounts. And we think we're going to have about $308,000 when we graduate. I'm going to send this over to the loan repayment simulator. And it's going to fill in a lot of this information for you, right? So 2024, graduating in May, here's the amount borrowed plus the interest that accrued, the weighted average interest rate, right? This information is already set for us unless we find out in the future that the COVID-19 suspension is going to be extended further. If you are planning to work towards public service loan forgiveness after graduation, this is where you would flip that switch. We're going to put in our income, right? So let's presume we're going to have a $100,000 income, and then you can change it year to year, or you can assume some kind of annual rate of growth, right? It's up to you. This is a good homework project. We're not going to be able to get into all of the ins and outs of why this is the way it is, but you have the ability to change this year by year, or you can set a flat rate of growth. If you are married or plan to be married in the future, this is where you would set that information and include all of your spouse's income, student debt information if they were to have that as well. We'll leave that out for the time being. When you have kids, or if you have kids now, that will also play a role in your student loan calculations. There's some advanced settings here, right? So what the tax rate will be on forgiveness, you can always change this later if you want to pay more, if it makes sense to do so. Once you start building a forgiveness fund, right, you can allocate how much you have so far, and we'll adjust how much you might need to save going forward. But those are probably beyond what we need to show right now because we just want to run the simulation and that stuff will be more apparent. So if, and let me increase this a little bit. Okay. All right, so we can start here to compare some of the different repayment strategies against each other, right? So here's the standard 10-year plan, right? So if I've got $308,000, I'm going to have a minimum monthly payment of $3,300 per month, right? Again, with a $100,000 income, this is more than 50% of my take-home pay, right? So this is probably not a good idea compared to what my income would require me to pay, $661, right? Even with that $100,000 income, that is a fraction of what the standard 10-year plan payment requires me to pay, right? And if I start working my way down, I see that I've got a whopping amount forgiven here, more than what I started with. But if I assume a tax rate of 30% on that, right, or you can change this to whatever you want, right, $125,000 I'm going to need to have on hand to pay the IRS. Even with that forgiveness, this is this total cost is significantly less than if I could find some way to pay the $3,300 per month for a 10-year period, right? And this is really what the game changer is, right? Some of these income-driven repayment plans, right, particularly when your balances are higher, your debt-to-income ratio is greater than 2, you're going to see this happen in nearly all of your simulations, is that the income-driven repayment plans are going to come out less expensive in total than even the standard 10-year plan payment. Now, this big side effect here is that you have to contend with this forgiveness, right? You have to do some guessing on what that tax rate's going to be, right? You have to plan for it, right? So this is what the forgiveness planning module is here to help you with. So if I have a $125,000 tax bill projected 20 years after I graduate, then I would need to start saving about $382 per month in some kind of combination of accounts that help me earn some interest on that savings, right? Here we're assuming 3% per year on average. That will actually decrease my costs even further, right? So it's, what this essentially shows is that it's going to cost me $91,000 to save the $125,000. The rest of it's going to be made up in interest from my long-term investing strategy here to meet my forgiveness goal, right? Which also helps me lower my total repayment costs. So this is why it's so important to at least be familiar with how this works, because you could be leaving a lot of money on the table, right? Thinking that you're doing a good thing by trying to pay your loans back as fast as possible. In reality, you could end up paying more, right? And you're going to have much less cash in your budget to work with to meet all of those other financial wellness goals that are so important. Particularly, a lot of them are very time sensitive, right? The earlier you get those things started, like emergency funds, like retirement savings, like working towards a down payment on a home, right? All of those things are going to allow you to get where you need to go quicker and adjust accordingly, right? Rather than trying to get to a loan balance of 0 first before you try to meet any of those other financial wellness goals. Okay, so that was a quick intro to the loan repayment simulator and how income-driven repayment can work, particularly for those higher student loan balances. But you will find, and that's what we're going to go into next, right, in this preparing for repayment, right? The student debt to income ratio, again, becomes an extremely important factor in helping you decide which repayment strategy is going to work best for you. So if you anticipate your student debt being greater than your income, right? So a debt to income ratio greater than 1 when you reach graduation, then this is what I want you to do, right? I want you to file a tax return before you graduate. After that, you're going to start a federal direct consolidation loan. That's going to let you end your grace period early and apply for an income-driven repayment plan. What the tax return is going to do is let you apply for income-driven repayment using the adjusted gross income, the taxable income number from that tax return, as documentation of your income. You can think of your tax return as the gold standard for documenting your income in income-driven repayment. And for most of you, during 4th year of veterinary school, you're not going to have an opportunity to make much income, if any at all, right? So your adjusted gross income on that tax return is probably going to be 0, right? You can voluntarily file a tax return even if you don't have to in order to have one on file. And then you can use that tax return to document your income, and you can get a $0 monthly payment for the first 12 months that you're in repayment using that tax return. Right? That gives you the opportunity to free up even more cash flow in your budget and really jumpstart your financial wellness. Right? So if we come back over to our simulation here, we have a 0 to 661 range. That's what that 0 is for. Right? If you take this approach, you could free up an additional $661 per month in your budget by making sure that you have a tax return on file that allows you to get that $0 payment in the first 12 months. Right? I can come up here and account for that. Right? So I can knock that down to 0 in the first 12 months and rerun my simulation. Right? And if I do that, my total repayment cost went down by nearly $12,000. Right? Now I have to increase the amount that I was going to save towards forgiveness because I'm going to have a little bit more forgiven, right? But the amount that I save just by filing that tax return, my tax is only $2,700 more than it was before, and I save, close to $12,000 or $15,000 in my total student loan repayment costs just by filing that tax return for that first year, right? So if you anticipate reaching forgiveness, or it's quite likely that you're going to reach forgiveness, then file that tax return before you graduate so you can get that $0 per month payment, and you'll free up even more money in your budget to reach those goals even sooner. If you want, we do a webinar in detail that's targeted specifically for graduating veterinarians every year, right around May, June, right after you graduate and you're starting to disperse onto your careers, right? Because we want you to take care of this stuff before you start that first job or internship, because once you do, all bets are off, right? I mean, it's you kind of forget about it again until that grace period ends, and then then you're scrambling to figure out what to do. So if you take that approach of graduate, consolidate, get your loans and income-driven repayment as soon as you possibly can, then all of that will be taken care of for you for at least that first 12 months that you're in repayment. So here again is our debt and income ranges, right? Just want you to be aware of what those numbers are or where you can find them to help you develop what that debt to income ratio is going to be. Once again, if your debt to income ratio is less than 1, then you don't have to worry about a lot of this forgiveness stuff. You can use income driven repayment strategically in that first couple of years as your income's just growing to really put a jump start in your financial wellness. But you're going to pay your loans to zero with little to no problem, right? I mean, 10% of your income is going to pay your loans to zero in 10 years or less when your debt to income ratio is less than 1, right? That's why that works. But if your debt to income ratio is greater than 2, then you're going to see what I just demonstrated in the simulator. You're going to see that income driven repayment is likely your lowest cost option, and it maximizes your cash flow throughout repayment. With the gray zone, again, I know that it's tempting to want to pay those loans off sooner rather than later, but let your income decide how fast it happens, right? If your income grows faster than you anticipated, great, congratulations. If it doesn't, that's okay, right? Your payment is still the same percentage of your income, which makes it more manageable. This is a look at what your new grad income will be, but we also have some data from the AVMA that shows what your income will be later, right? So if we put everybody in the same bucket and we start to look at average incomes, recent incomes from 2019 across various practice types, we can see that a lot of them are, above or near the $100,000 level. Right. So, I know I focus a lot on that new grad income, but you should look beyond too to see what income does as you progress in your career. Recently, the most recent AVMA economic report has some pretty cool data on the salary by ownership, gender, and career length. Right. So this is for associates. So early career, you can see that the incomes are lower. Mid-career, they're going up, and then late career, they tend to stabilize, right? At some point here, you can only see so many clients in a day, right? So your income will tend to stabilize. For practice owners, we can see that the numbers are quite a bit higher. There are definitely some gender disparities here between the income that we have to figure out a way to either correct or know more about. But the data is there, right? Use this information to help you make some of these decisions in terms of where you see your career going, how you should pay back your student loans, right? And filling in some of those variables that are required when you're making a loan repayment strategy decision. Okay, let's talk about interest. So this is a common misconception when it comes to student loan repayment. So we have to talk about how interest behaves. So what is interest? Interest is that charge for you not having the money yourself, essentially, right? So somebody lends you the money because most of us aren't walking around with $200,000 to pay for that veterinary education. So somebody, in this case, the Department of Education, lends us those funds, and they charge us interest for that, right? And that interest is charged and applied in a particular manner. For your student loans, it's a simple interest calculation. So simple interest is a very specific type of calculation on how interest is applied, commonly confused with compounding interest, right? But they are not the same thing. Right? Your federal student loans do not compound. Right? So compound is when we take interest and we continually add it to your principal, and then you generate more interest, which then gets added to your principal, and then you have more and more and more, and it keeps growing and growing and growing. That's compounding. Simple interest is not the same thing. You get charged interest on your principal, and that interest actually sits in its own unpaid interest bucket, right? And it doesn't get charged, you don't get charged additional interest on that interest unless it capitalizes. Right? And there are certain events that cause capitalization on federal student loans. Here are some of the more common reasons that you might see interest capitalization. The biggest being deferment and forbearance. Right? So after graduation, if you have one of these things, and nearly everybody goes through one of these events after graduation, the temptation is to put your loans into deferment or forbearance. You do not want to do that. Right? Do not defer your loans after school, right? It's okay that they're deferred now while you're in school, but don't defer them after you graduate and when you enter repayment, right? The most common occurrence I see this for is internships and residencies, right? But the problem is the interest continues to accrue. And then once you come out of that deferment period, they take that interest and they add it to your principal. Just like the interest from your school loans are going to get added to your principal once you graduate and enter repayment, any interest that you accrue after that for any subsequent deferment periods will also get added to your principal. Triggers this unnecessary capitalization, which has you paying more towards your student loans, and it has you in repayment longer, right? So avoid those things. You can avoid this interest capitalization by using an income-driven repayment plan. You'll still accrue interest, right? Because if you're doing an internship or residency, or if you've got that $0 payment on your loans, even if they're in income-driven repayment, you'll still accrue interest. But the big difference is when your income goes up, they won't take that interest and add it to your principal, right? So that interest stays in the unpaid interest bucket, which means you will accrue less interest for the duration of repayment, right? And likely most of that will get handled through the forgiveness provision. So if you're headed into an internship or residency, do not defer or forbear your loans. Put them into an income-driven repayment plan. Pay the little bit that you might have to pay based on your internship or residency salary, and enjoy not having your interest capitalized once you finish your advanced education. So colleagues, don't let other colleagues defer their student loans. Spread the word. Okay. All right, so just to make you aware again, right, if you have any questions on this, bring them to the live SAVMA Q&A session on student loans and repayment options. We're going to have that Sunday, March 14th at 1 p.m. Central Time. Happy to take any questions that you have about anything that we've covered here during these sessions. Just want to bring you back over to the loan repayment simulator here again to illustrate this concept that paying based on your income is generally a better approach. Let's come up here though, and because I'm using one that's a little bit on the higher end for student debt. Let's do one that's at the lower end, right? Let's cut this quite a bit, and we'll have the interest rate will be lower, right? And we can do the same thing with our income, right? And let's see how the game changes here. Right, so let's say we had $138,000 and $100,000 starting income. You can see here that it's still, in my opinion, makes more sense to get started in an income-driven repayment plan because I have this flexibility, right? The number is not as great, but there's still nearly $800 there that I can benefit from in my budget in that first 12 months that I'm getting started as a veterinarian, right? That's $800 that I can use to really jumpstart that emergency fund, right? So I don't put myself into credit card debt. Or it's $800 a month that I can use to start maxing out my retirement fund contributions that will grow and compound long term, right? So when somebody tells you that you should forego retirement savings until you pay back your student loans, they're completely wrong, right? Your retirement savings will experience compound long-term growth, and a lot of your retirement savings contributions have some tax benefits as well that will way outgrow any benefit from paying your student loans first, right? So focus on all of those other areas of your financial wellness, maximizing retirement savings, right? Particularly those tax deferred options if you can. Having an emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of your expenses at least. Start working towards a down payment on a home, which is one of those, purchases that can really help you build wealth, right? But it's a lot easier to do so when you have some money to bring to the table. Get that 10, 20% down payment so you can reduce the impact of any of that mortgage insurance that you might have to pay and start building that equity in your home, right? You can do that with your student loan balance, right? My wife and I have 2 mortgages and we have $400,000 of student loans. And the income-driven repayment plans can actually make that easier, right? So having a payment that is this on your credit report looks a lot better than this, right? Because this is 10% of my discretionary income. This is higher, right? This is probably closer to 20%, right? So that's, in that case, you're going to look like a better borrowing candidate to your lender if you're bringing money to the table and your credit report shows this for your student loan payment instead of this. Even with that lower student loan balance, we see here that paying based on my income, I would pay my loans back. I don't hit forgiveness in this case, right? Because my income generates enough of a monthly payment to actually pay the balance in full before I reach forgiveness. Now, in this situation, it might make sense for me to pay a little bit more towards my student loans once I've got my budget tuned in and I know that I've taken care of all of those other financial wellness items and I still have a little bit more left. I might consider paying a little bit extra towards my student loans, and that will reduce my total costs and ideally bring it closer to something like this, right? So when my debt to income ratio, if I look down here at some of these other graphs, right? So here's my monthly payment exceeds my interest, right? The sooner that happens under an income driven repayment plan, the more likely it is that you'll pay your balance to zero before you hit forgiveness, right? Versus the previous simulation where, there was no chance that we were going to touch any of the interest associated with our monthly student loan payment because the balance was too high, right? So in these cases, that's when, adding a little bit extra towards your monthly student loan payment can help, right? But if you do that, if you throw extra towards your student loans when your balance is really high, right? So if I paid $100 a month here, I knocked a year and a half off of repayment, and now my total costs are starting to come down, right? And the time that I'm in repayment starts to come down. If I do that same thing with my debt to income ratio greater than 2, all I do is increase my total cost, right? Because I still hit forgiveness, I still have to save for the tax, but I'm just throwing more towards my student loans than I have to, right? So that's where the student debt to income ratio number comes in so important, but also how even if you have a lower student debt balance, you can use these repayment plans strategically to help you jumpstart your repayment plan and then, kind of customize your repayment strategy going forward depending on how your income changes over time. Okay, last plug for drip.vet. So again, this is some really complicated stuff, right? So finance is not something that a lot of veterinarians are introduced to as they work their way through veterinary school or on their way to veterinary school. That's why things like the drip.vet course, the personal financial success, is so valuable, right? It helps you to build that foundation of financial knowledge that will make you, that will help you achieve your financial goals sooner rather than later, right? You can certainly learn all of this the hard way, but try not to make all of the mistakes that we keep making, learn from those mistakes, right? So build on some of these financial concepts early and often, and you'll put yourself in a much better position to reach your financial goals sooner rather than later. Okay, well, that concludes the Climbing Mount Debt sessions. Hopefully that's not too much for you to all digest, and that you find the breaking them up into the 3 different sessions is a little bit more easy to comprehend. I'd love to hear some feedback on that. So please stop by again to that live Q&A session on Sunday at 1 p.m. Central Time and send me some of that feedback either to the email here or provide that during the live session. And I'll look forward to answering any questions that you all have as part of that live Q&A. So thanks again, and looking forward to when we can do these again live in the future. Stay safe, stay well, and please let us know how we can help in any way when it comes to your student loans and repayment questions. Thank you.